Welcome to the Rainy Night Storyteller, where every raindrop carries a tale and the night whispers secrets from the past. Tonight, we find ourselves aboard a storm-tossed ship, in a cabin filled with shadows, mystery, and untold horrors. Our journey begins with a classic Gothic tale, The Upper Berth by Marion Crawford. In this chilling story, a seasoned traveler unravels the sinister truth behind the most dreaded cabin on a luxury liner. What lurks in the darkness of the upper berth will send shivers down your spine and leave you questioning the boundaries of reality. But our voyage does not end there. Following this timeless classic, I will guide you into an original story of a haunted ship cursed to drift between the past and the present. In this tale, the line between the living and the dead blurs as those aboard the ship are drawn into a never-ending nightmare. Secrets long buried beneath the waves resurface, threatening to claim new victims. As the rain beats against the window and the storm rages on, let these tales carry you into the heart of the unknown. Dim the lights, let the sound of the storm surround you, and prepare for a night of stories that will stay with you long after the rain subsides. The Upper Berth by Marion Crawford is a tale of mystery and terror that begins aboard a great ocean liner, the Kamchatka. Let us step into the smoking room, where the atmosphere is thick with cigar smoke and the low hum of conversation. The room was alive with the chatter of passengers, sharing anecdotes and passing time. Brisbane, a man of calm demeanor and skeptical nature, listened to the talk with mild amusement. He had heard tales of the supernatural before and dismissed them as nothing more than idle fancy. He was not one to be easily frightened. As the evening wore on, the conversation took a darker turn. One of the men, a sharp-eyed and serious fellow, leaned forward and spoke. "What of room 105?" he asked. His voice cut through the smoky haze, drawing the attention of everyone in the room. Brisbane raised an eyebrow. "Room 105?" The man continued, his tone low and deliberate. He spoke of strange happenings in that stateroom, of men who had met tragic and inexplicable ends. One had gone mad, raving incoherently before his death. Another had been found drowned in his bed, though not a drop of seawater had entered the room. The others listened with growing unease, but Brisbane smiled. He dismissed the tale as superstition, a ghost story told to entertain. "I'll take room 105 tonight," he declared with a confident smirk. "And in the morning, I'll prove there's nothing to fear." The challenge was accepted, and Brisbane left the smoking room with an air of nonchalance. Yet, as he walked the dimly lit corridor toward his cabin, he felt a strange chill in the air. The shadows seemed to deepen, and the silence grew heavy. When he reached the door of room 105, he paused briefly before unlocking it. The room was unremarkable, compact and clean, with two berths, one above the other. But as Brisbane stepped inside, an odd sensation came over him. The air was damp and carried the faint scent of the sea. The walls seemed to glisten in the dim light, as though touched by moisture, and the upper berth, empty yet strangely oppressive, seemed to hold an unspoken weight, as if it had been waiting for him. Brisbane shook off the feeling with a dismissive laugh. "Imagination," he muttered to himself, "nothing more than shadows playing tricks." He prepared for bed, confident that he would sleep soundly and emerge in the morning to silence the superstitions once and for all. But sleep did not come easily. The room seemed alive with an intangible presence, and Brisbane found himself lying awake, listening to the faint creaks and groans of the ship. The air grew colder as the hours passed, and the oppressive dampness became almost unbearable. And so, the night began, and with it, the first whispers of the room's terrible secret. This concludes Chapter 1 of The Upper Berth. Join me again as we delve deeper into this haunting tale, uncovering the mysteries that lurk aboard the Kamchatka. Until then, sleep well, if you can. Chapter 2. As the night deepens aboard the Kamchatka, Brisbane's skepticism will be tested in ways he could never have imagined. Let us return to his story. Brisbane awoke with a start, though he could not recall having fallen asleep. The air in the room was colder than before, and the dampness seemed to seep into his very bones. For a moment, he lay still, listening to the silence. But it was not complete silence. There was something else, a faint sound rhythmic and soft, like the shallow breathing of a sleeper. He sat up in bed, his eyes fixed on the upper berth. It was dark, the dim glow of the cabin's lamp casting only the faintest of shadows. He told himself it was nothing, a creak of the ship, the whisper of waves against the hull. Yet the sound persisted. It was undeniably human, and it was coming from the berth above. Brisbane's pulse quickened. Slowly, he reached for the lamp and held it aloft, its weak light revealing the empty cabin. The upper berth was just as it had been before, made up, undisturbed, and utterly vacant. He exhaled, shaking his head. "Foolishness," he muttered. "Just the mind playing tricks in the dark." He set the lamp back on the table and lay down once more, determined to sleep. But as the minutes dragged on, the oppressive atmosphere of the room only grew heavier. The dampness in the air was now accompanied by a faint but distinct odor, a smell like seaweed, salt, and decay. It was faint but nauseating, and it seemed to emanate from the direction of the upper berth. A sharp knock on the door broke the stillness. Brisbane sat up, his heart pounding. "Come in," he called, but the door remained closed. Rising, he crossed the room and opened it. There was no one there. The corridor was empty, the faint hum of the ship the only sound. Closing the door, he returned to his bed, a sense of unease creeping over him. He was a man of reason, but the events of the night were testing his resolve. He lay down once more, trying to ignore the strange sensations that seemed to close in around him. But then it happened, a sudden, sharp movement above him, the unmistakable sound of someone, or something, shifting in the upper berth. His breath caught in his throat. This time, he was certain. He sat up, his eyes fixed on the dark outline of the berth. The sound came again, a faint rustling, as if a body were turning over in its sleep. Grabbing the lamp, Brisbane stood and moved toward the upper berth. The smell grew stronger as he approached, a sickly, briny stench that made his stomach churn. He hesitated, his hand hovering just inches from the curtain that hung before the berth. Taking a deep breath, he yanked it aside. The berth was empty. He stood there for a long moment, staring at the undisturbed bedding. His mind raced, searching for a rational explanation. Perhaps the ship's motion had caused the noise. Perhaps the smell was simply the dampness of the room. But deep down, he knew these were lies he told himself to keep the fear at bay. Returning to his bed, Brisbane resolved to stay awake for the rest of the night. He would not sleep, not in this room, not with the unshakable feeling that he was not alone. And so he sat, lamp in hand, waiting for the dawn. The night stretched on, the oppressive silence broken only by the creaks and groans of the ship. The upper berth remained still, yet its presence loomed over him, filling the room with an almost tangible sense of dread. When morning finally came, the first rays of sunlight filtering through the porthole, Brisbane felt a wave of relief wash over him. He dressed quickly, eager to leave room 105 behind. But as he stepped into the corridor, he could not shake the feeling that something had followed him, that the room itself was watching him go. This concludes Chapter 2 of The Upper Berth. The story grows darker with each passing night aboard the Kamtschatka. Join me next time as we uncover the chilling truth that haunts room 105. Until then, may the rain soothe your mind and keep your dreams free of shadows. Chapter 3. Brisbane had not returned to room 105 since the events of the previous night. The memory of the cold, the smell, and the strange sounds that seemed to echo in the room haunted him as he went about his day. He could not shake the feeling that something was wrong, that something had followed him from that cabin, something he could not explain away. In the hours before dinner, he had spoken to the ship's officers, but their reactions were not what he expected. They were all too quick to dismiss his concerns, their faces almost unreadable. It was as though they had heard similar stories before and were simply too weary to respond. One of them, the first officer, looked at him with a quiet, knowing expression. "Room 105, the officer repeated, his voice low. "There's not much to say, sir. It's a room for passengers in transit, that's all. But I would recommend staying clear of it, if I were you." Brisbane, unsettled by the officer's response, had left the conversation quickly. What was there to be afraid of? He had heard nothing, seen nothing to truly frighten him. Still, that nagging doubt lingered. He had resolved to take another look at the room that evening. As night fell, Brisbane found himself walking back toward the dreaded door of room 105, this time with a mixture of trepidation and curiosity. The ship rocked gently beneath him, and the sound of the storm outside only added to the sense of isolation. He stopped before the door, his hand hovering over the doorknob, and paused. It was then that he heard it, a soft, almost imperceptible sound, like the faintest breath being drawn, coming from inside the room. He froze, his heart pounding. It was as though something was waiting for him inside. With a sharp intake of breath, he turned the handle and stepped into the cabin. At first, the room seemed unchanged. The same dampness clung to the air, and the smell of the sea lingered, though it was less pronounced than before. The upper berth was still made up, and everything appeared undisturbed. But then, the faintest rustling came again. This time, it was louder, closer, a distinct sound, like something moving in the berth above him. Brisbane stepped forward, his eyes drawn to the top bunk. He felt a chill creep over his skin, a sensation he couldn't shake. The rustling stopped abruptly. Brisbane's breath caught in his throat. He stood there, waiting, his eyes never leaving the upper berth. His fingers clenched around the lamp in his hand. And then, without warning, the upper berth swung down as if an invisible hand had pulled it. It dropped with a sudden, jarring force, the bedclothes shifting as if something had just occupied it. Brisbane's pulse quickened. He rushed forward, pulling the curtains aside. There was nothing. The berth was empty, just as it had been before. The bedding lay still, as though no one had touched it. But then, as he stood there, staring at the empty berth, he felt a presence. Something behind him, something that was not there before. He spun around, his heart hammering in his chest. The room was still, silent, but there was a weight to the air, as if the very space around him was holding its breath. His mind raced. It had to be a trick of the light, a strange shift in the ship's motion, the creaking of the wood, the whispers of the sea. It had to be. And yet, deep down, Brisbane knew that the room was more than just a place. He could feel it. The room had become a thing in itself, a force that lingered long after the people who had stayed there were gone. Whatever it was, it had claimed its space, and it was not ready to let go. Brisbane backed away, his thoughts a tangled mess. He needed to leave, to get away from this room, from this presence that seemed to grow stronger with each passing moment. As he turned to leave, he hesitated. The door was still open, the corridor beyond bathed in the dim light of the ship's lanterns. He glanced back one last time, as if expecting to see something lurking in the shadows, watching him. But there was nothing. The cabin was empty once again. With a quick, shaky breath, he left the room, closing the door behind him. As the lock clicked into place, he felt a wave of relief wash over him, though it was brief. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was still there, waiting. But what was it? And what did it want? Brisbane knew one thing for certain. Room 105 was not like any other room on the camp's Chaka. There was something deeply wrong with it, and he would not be the last to feel its grip. This concludes Chapter 3 of The Upper Berth. Brisbane's story grows ever darker. Join me in the next chapter as we uncover more of the mystery that haunts Room 105 aboard the camp's Chaka. Until then, sleep well, and may the rain keep you safe from the shadows that linger. Chapter 4. Brisbane's journey aboard the camp's Chaka has become increasingly unsettling. The dark mystery of Room 105 continues to deepen. Let us return to the tale. The following morning, Brisbane was determined to put his fears behind him. He had left Room 105 in haste the night before, and now, in the light of day, he resolved to confront the strange happenings head-on. He would not be driven to superstition. He was a man of reason, after all. But even as he tried to shake off the unease, the events of the previous night haunted him. Though he tried to keep his composure, something about the morning felt different. The air aboard the camp's Chaka seemed heavier than usual, thick with the scent of salt water and damp wood. And yet, Brisbane knew this was only in his mind. There was no real reason to be afraid. As the day passed, Brisbane busied himself with other matters, trying to put room 105 out of his thoughts. But he could not escape the nagging feeling that something was terribly wrong. It wasn't just the strange noises or the sensation of being watched. It was something deeper, something more instinctual, a sense of foreboding that clung to him, even in the crowded dining room, even amidst the laughter and conversations of the other passengers. That evening, Brisbane returned to the smoking room. He had hoped to find some relief in conversation, to drown out the growing sense of dread. But the moment he entered, the room seemed to grow colder. The murmur of voices fell to a hushed whisper as several of the men turned to look at him. It was a look that was all too familiar, the knowing look of someone who had already heard the stories. The first officer, whom Brisbane had spoken with earlier, gave him a polite nod but said nothing. One of the passengers, a man who had been quiet until now, spoke up. "You've been in room 105, haven't you?" he asked. The question was simple, yet the room seemed to hold its breath as the words left his mouth. Brisbane nodded, trying to keep his expression neutral. "Yes," he said, his voice steady, "but I don't believe in such things. It's just an old superstition." The man across from him smiled, though it was not a comforting smile. "It's not superstition, my friend," he said softly. "There's something wrong with that room. I've seen it myself. I was once in there, and I didn't sleep a wink. It was as though the room itself had eyes, watching me, waiting." Brisbane felt a chill run down his spine. He had hoped to escape the subject, but now it was impossible to ignore. "What happened?" he asked, though he almost regretted it as soon as the words left his lips. The man leaned forward, his eyes darkening. "I don't know exactly. All I can say is that there's a presence in that room. I don't know what it is, but it's real. It's been there long before any of us arrived." Brisbane felt his skepticism begin to waver. He had tried to rationalize everything, but the accounts of others, the strange occurrences in the room, nothing seemed to make sense. That night, as he lay in his cabin, Brisbane could not shake the feeling of dread that settled over him. He had tried to avoid room 105, but it was impossible to ignore. The events of the previous night, the rustling in the upper berth, the strange sensation of being watched, were all still fresh in his mind. And the more he thought about it, the more the room seemed to haunt him. He had to return. He had to understand. With trembling hands, he dressed quickly, his breath shallow as he made his way down the corridor to the dreaded room. The ship rocked gently beneath him, and the storm outside seemed to grow stronger, as if the weather itself mirrored the turbulence in his mind. Standing before the door to room 105, Brisbane hesitated. The sound of the waves crashing against the hull of the ship seemed to echo in the quiet corridor. He could feel the weight of the door before he even touched the handle. He opened it slowly, the familiar scent of salt and dampness rushing to meet him. The room was just as it had been before, still, quiet, and unremarkable. The upper berth hung suspended above him, empty, waiting. Brisbane stepped inside, his eyes scanning the room. For a long moment, there was no sound, nothing out of the ordinary. The quiet was almost oppressive, the silence more unsettling than the noise had been the night before. But then, as he stood there, staring at the empty berth, the room seemed to shift. A subtle change in the air, a slight movement that caught his eye. He turned slowly, his heart pounding in his chest. The curtains of the upper berth rustled, as though someone was stirring beneath them. Brisbane's breath caught in his throat. He stood frozen, unable to move, as the sound grew louder. It wasn't just rustling anymore. There was a faint, muffled noise, like soft footsteps, moving across the berth, coming closer to the edge. Brisbane's pulse raced as he stepped forward, heart thudding in his ears. He reached out, his hand trembling, and pulled back the curtain with a forceful jerk. The berth was empty. He stumbled back, his head spinning. There was no one there. The bedding lay undisturbed, yet the sense of someone, was undeniable. It filled the room, clinging to the air, pressing in on him. Brisbane's mind raced. This wasn't possible. It couldn't be real. And yet, the longer he stood there, the more he felt it. The oppressive presence that seemed to pulse within the very walls of the room. He turned and fled from the room, slamming the door behind him. The hallway was empty, and the ship seemed eerily quiet, as though the very vessel was holding its breath. Brisbane knew then that he could never return. Room 105 had claimed him, just as it had claimed all who came before him. This concludes Chapter 4 of the Upper Berth. Join me again as we uncover the deeper truths behind the haunting presence of Room 105. Until then, sleep well, and remember, some rooms are best left alone. Chapter 5. Brisbane's stay aboard the Kamtschatka grows increasingly unbearable as the mystery of Room 105 takes an even darker turn. Let us return to the story. The following day, Brisbane's nerves were on edge. He could no longer deny the truth that was slowly dawning on him. Room 105 was not merely a room. It was something else, something far older and far more sinister than he could have imagined. His sleep had been fitful, plagued by the same disturbing sensations, the same feeling of being watched. The air had never felt so heavy, and no matter how many times he tried to distract himself, the thought of returning to that room gnawed at him. Yet, despite everything, he could not resist. He knew he had to understand what was happening. The strange occurrences aboard the Kamtschatka, the unsettling stories from the other passengers, the feeling of being drawn toward Room 105. It all led him back there, as though the room itself was calling him. As night fell once more, Brisbane found himself once again standing in front of the door to Room 105. This time, his resolve was weaker. His hand trembled as it rested on the doorknob, but he refused to turn back. He had come this far. He had to finish what he had started. The unknown, with all its dark allure, seemed to possess him now. The ship's lanterns flickered faintly as he opened the door. The room was as silent as ever. The smell of salt and damp wood hung in the air, and the shadows in the corners seemed to stretch and deepen. The upper berth was empty, its sheets lying perfectly flat, as though no one had been there for days. But something felt different. The silence seemed heavier, thicker, as if the room itself was holding its breath. Brisbane stepped inside, his heart pounding in his chest. He felt a cold draft brush against his skin, though the door had been shut. A shiver ran down his spine as he turned slowly, his gaze drifting over the familiar surroundings. And then, again, the rustling sound. It was faint at first, almost imperceptible, but it was there. A soft shuffling sound, like footsteps shifting on the berth above. His breath caught in his throat. He had heard it before, but now it was louder, more pronounced. Brisbane's heart raced, and his hands tightened around the lamp. His legs were unsteady, but his curiosity and something deeper, something primal, urged him forward. He reached out for the curtain to the upper berth, but before he could pull it aside, the sound stopped. The room fell into an unnatural stillness. A cold sweat broke out across his brow as he stood motionless, waiting. Every part of him wanted to leave, to run far from this place. But he couldn't. Not yet. He had to know what was making that noise. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, he reached out and yanked the curtain aside. The upper berth was empty. The bedclothes lay perfectly still, as though nothing had disturbed them. There was no sign of anyone or anything. Yet Brisbane felt the presence. Something was there, something invisible, watching him. His pulse quickened as the air around him grew colder. The shadows in the room seemed to deepen, pressing in on him from every angle. He glanced over his shoulder, half expecting to see something lurking in the darkness, but there was nothing. The room was as it always had been. Still, the feeling remained, the sensation that he was not alone. A sudden, sharp sound broke the silence, the unmistakable sound of something moving or someone. It came from the far corner of the room. Brisbane spun around, his heart pounding, but there was nothing, only the shadows, growing darker, more oppressive. His hands were shaking now, his mind racing. He had to get out of the room. He couldn't stay here any longer. But before he could make a move, a faint whisper reached his ears. It was soft, almost inaudible, but it was there, coming from the upper berth. "Get out." The words were clear, and they were unmistakably real. His stomach twisted as his legs faltered beneath him. The voice was low, almost mocking. and yet it carried an undeniable command. Get out. Brisbane's body reacted before his mind could catch up. He turned and fled from the room, slamming the door behind him. His breath was ragged, his heart beating in his throat as he stood in the empty hallway. The air felt colder than ever before, and for the first time, he could not shake the feeling that he was being followed, that something had been left behind in that room, and it was coming after him. The ship's steady rocking seemed to grow more erratic, the sounds of the waves crashing against the hull growing louder. Brisbane stood there, trying to steady his breathing, but he could not dispel the horror that clung to him. What had just happened? He could not explain it, could not understand it. But the voice, the command to leave, it was real. He had heard it, and it was not the first time. As he stood in the dimly lit corridor, his thoughts began to spiral. The feeling of being watched, the strange, unexplainable occurrences, it was all connected. Room 105 had not just claimed the others. It was claiming him as well. Brisbane turned away from the door, his mind a whirlwind of confusion and fear. He knew he could not stay, but he also knew that leaving the ship, leaving room 105 behind, would not erase what had happened. It would not erase the dark presence that now lingered in his mind. And so, he walked away, though he could not shake the feeling that the room was still there, still waiting for him. This concludes Chapter 5 of the Upper Berth. The mystery continues to deepen, and Brisbane's terror grows stronger with each passing night. Join me again as we continue our journey through the darkness that surrounds room 105. Until then, may the rain calm your restless thoughts and keep the shadows at bay. And so, the mystery of the Upper Berth remains, a chilling reminder that some secrets of the sea are better left undisturbed. The shadows in that cursed cabin, the unspeakable horrors witnessed by those who dared stay, will haunt their memories forever. Perhaps the next time you board a ship, you'll think twice about where you sleep. But our night is far from over. The storm still rages, and the haunted sea has more stories to tell. Join me now as we leave the realm of the classic and step into an original tale, a cursed ship trapped in a time loop where the past and present collide, and no one who boards ever truly escapes. Let the rain guide us as we venture into the unknown. The Eternal Voyage, Shadows of the Cursed Ship. Chapter 1. The voyage begins. It was a night that seemed to stretch beyond the grasp of time itself. The horizon was shrouded in mist, and the ocean mirrored the darkened sky. Somewhere in that vast, unyielding void, the legendary ship known as Eclipse Mariner lay hidden. A ghostly vessel whispered about in the hushed tones of folklore. They said it drifted between the folds of time, cursed to haunt the seas for eternity. Our tale begins with a group of 5 friends: Eleanor, a brilliant yet skeptical historian; Jason, an adrenaline seeker with a passion for the supernatural; Mira, a tech-savvy investigator with a knack for unraveling mysteries; Caleb, a reluctant skeptic dragged along by his adventurous girlfriend; and Sophia, whose eerie dreams of a ship had led them to this venture. Each carried their own reasons for chasing the myth, but none could have imagined the fate awaiting them. The group had pooled their resources to charter a small vessel to investigate the Eclipse Mariner. They had combed through old maps, cryptic journals, and forgotten records, piecing together clues that suggested the ship's most recent sighting. Somewhere off the coast of Nova Scotia, it had emerged, a specter that lured sailors to their doom. As the friends stood on the deck of their rented boat, staring into the dark, endless waters, the air seemed unnaturally still. Jason broke the silence with a grin, his flashlight catching the wary expressions of the others. "Well," he said, "this is it. The great ghost hunt begins." Eleanor adjusted her glasses, her tone clipped. "This isn't a ghost hunt. It's a historical expedition. There are logical explanations for the Eclipse Mariner's disappearance. Maritime accidents, storms, maybe pirates, or time-traveling ghosts," Mira added with a wink, tapping on her tablet. "Come on, Eleanor. Don't ruin the fun." Sophia remained quiet, staring out at the ocean. Her dreams of the ship had been vivid, too vivid. A creaking deck, the sound of laughter fading into screams, and a voice, soft yet commanding, whispering her name. She hadn't told the others about the voice. The boat's captain, an older man with weathered features, approached them. "We're nearing the coordinates you gave me," he said. His voice was gruff, edged with unease. "I've been in these waters for 40 years and never seen anything like what you're looking for. Don't go chasing ghosts too far." Jason chuckled. "That's exactly what we're here for." But as the words left his mouth, the boat's lights flickered and the engines sputtered. The captain frowned, heading toward the control room, muttering about electrical problems. The group exchanged uneasy glances. Moments later, a dense fog began to roll in, thick and unnatural. Mira checked her GPS, frowning as the screen flickered before going blank. "That's weird. This thing has a full charge." Eleanor looked up, her voice tinged with apprehension. "Fog doesn't roll in this fast. Something's not right." Then, through the haze, a silhouette began to take shape. It was a ship, larger than life, its towering masts like skeletal fingers clawing at the sky. Its hull gleamed faintly, as though it absorbed the light rather than reflected it. The name Eclipse Mariner was etched into its side, the letters weathered yet unmistakable. The friends stood frozen, a mixture of awe and dread settling over them. Jason broke the silence, his voice trembling despite his bravado. "We found it, the Eclipse Mariner." The ship loomed closer, and the air grew colder, laced with the faint scent of decay. A faint melody drifted across the water, a haunting tune played on an unseen piano, and then, as if compelled by an unseen force, their boat began to drift toward the ship. "No!" the captain shouted from the control room. "This isn't right. The engine's dead, but we're moving." The group clung to the railing as the Eclipse Mariner loomed larger, its ghostly presence casting a shadow that seemed to devour the light. The melody grew louder, and Sophia's eyes widened. She recognized the tune. It was the same one she had heard in her dreams. And then, the voice returned, soft yet commanding, "Welcome home." The friends turned to Sophia, her pale face reflecting the growing terror. Before anyone could speak, the boat collided gently with the ghost ship's hull. A gangplank, worn yet solid, descended as though inviting them aboard. As they hesitated, the fog closed in, swallowing the world behind them. The only path now lay forward, into the bowels of the cursed ship. Chapter 2. Echoes of the Past. The Eclipse Mariner stood before them like a relic from another time, its weathered timbers and corroded metal exuding a ghostly luminescence. The gangplank, impossibly sturdy for a ship so ancient, extended toward their trembling boat as if beckoning them to cross. "No way," Caleb muttered, his voice quaking. "This is insane. We shouldn't be here." Eleanor, clutching her notebook tightly, hesitated. "If we turn back now, we might never get this chance again. This is history in its most chilling form." Jason, driven by curiosity and an eagerness to prove himself, stepped forward. "If it's so dangerous, why hasn't it sunk? Why does it look like it's waiting for us?" Sophia remained silent, her eyes locked on the gangplank. The melody from her dreams, faint but distinct, continued to drift from the ship. It wasn't just a tune, it was a call. "Are we really doing this?" Mira asked, glancing nervously at Eleanor. Without waiting for an answer, Jason stepped onto the gangplank. It creaked beneath his weight, but held firm. "We've come this far. We owe it to ourselves to see what's inside." One by one, they followed, fear and curiosity warring within them. The captain of their boat shouted after them, but his words were swallowed by the thick fog, which now encased the small vessel in silence. The ship's entrance, crossing the gangplank, felt like stepping into another world. The moment their feet touched the deck, an oppressive chill enveloped them. The fog dissipated slightly, revealing the haunting grandeur of the ship. The deck was eerily clean, its wood glistening as though it had just been polished. Lanterns along the railings flickered with an unnatural light, casting shadows that danced like specters. "This can't be real," Mira whispered, scanning the surroundings with her camera. "The ship's been missing for decades. It should be in ruins." Sophia's gaze was drawn to a plaque near the main entrance. The engraving read, "Eclipse Mariner, Maiden Voyage, 1898. Bound for eternity. It feels alive, Sophia murmured, her voice barely audible. Eleanor, ever the rational one, adjusted her glasses. There's probably an explanation for all this. Preserved somehow, maybe a government project that... A loud groan interrupted her, echoing from deep within the ship. It was a sound that resonated in their chests, primal and unnatural. Jason grinned nervously. Maybe it's just settling. Old wood, right? The melody swelled, louder now, coming from the grand staircase that led deeper into the ship. Ornate and imposing, it looked untouched by time. The railings carved with intricate patterns of waves and storms. I don't like this, Caleb muttered, gripping Sophia's arm. We need to leave. Now. But Sophia, as though in a trance, stepped toward the staircase. I've heard this before. In my dreams. It's calling me. Sophia, stop, Eleanor urged. But it was too late. As Sophia reached the first step, the air grew colder. The lanterns flickered violently, and a low whisper filled the air. Indistinct at first, then forming words. Why have you come? The voice was neither male nor female, but a blend of tones, ancient and weary. The group froze, exchanging wide-eyed glances. Jason, always quick to mask fear with bravado, called out. We're here to learn about you. About the ship. What happened here? The whispers turned into faint laughter, chilling and hollow. You have come to remember, the voice said, and to suffer. Suddenly, the walls seemed to shift, the ornate carvings along the staircase twisting and writhing as if alive. The melody abruptly stopped, replaced by the sound of footsteps, heavy, deliberate, and approaching from above. Mira gripped her camera tightly. Who's there? She stammered, pointing the lens upward. A figure emerged at the top of the staircase. Dressed in a tattered naval uniform, its face was shrouded in shadow, but its eyes burned with a pale blue light. Leave this place, it growled, its voice layered with echoes. You do not belong here. The group stumbled back, panic setting in, but as they turned toward the gangplank, it was gone, replaced by a solid wall of mist and wood. We're trapped, Caleb breathed, his voice trembling. The figure descended the staircase slowly, each step reverberating like a drumbeat. You have crossed the threshold, it said. There is no escape, only the truth. The door opens. Before anyone could respond, the floor beneath them shuddered violently. The deck tilted, and they struggled to keep their footing. The ship seemed alive, groaning and creaking as though awakening from a deep slumber. The figure raised a hand, pointing toward a set of double doors at the end of the hall. The answers you seek lie within. But beware, the past does not forgive. The doors creaked open of their own accord, revealing a dimly lit corridor lined with portraits. Each painting depicted passengers in various states of joy, despair, or fear. Sophia, compelled by an unseen force, took the lead. The others followed reluctantly, their footsteps echoing in the eerie silence. As they crossed the threshold, the doors slammed shut behind them. The air grew heavier, the weight of countless untold stories pressing down on them. Unseen eyes watched from the shadows as they ventured deeper into the cursed ship, and the voice, soft and mocking, whispered once more, "Welcome to the Eclipse, Mariner. Let the voyage begin." Chapter 3. The Portrait Corridor. The narrow corridor stretched endlessly, its walls lined with haunting portraits that seemed to watch the group's every move. Each painting depicted a moment frozen in time. Passengers in fine clothing smiling at a dinner table, children playing on the deck, and crew members standing proudly by the ship's railings. Yet, the longer the friends stared, the more unsettling the images became. The smiles in the paintings seemed forced, their eyes hollow. Some of the faces appeared distorted, as if they had been smeared by an invisible hand. A faint smell of seawater and decay lingered in the air, growing stronger with each step. Sophia, walking ahead, paused before a large portrait. It showed a woman in an elegant gown, her face hidden behind a delicate lace veil. Something about the figure sent chills down her spine. "She looks familiar," Sophia whispered, her hand trembling as she reached out to touch the frame. "Don't," Mira hissed, pulling her back. "We don't know what this ship is capable of." Eleanor studied the portraits with growing unease. These people, they might have been passengers, maybe crew members, but why would their faces change? "They're not just paintings," Caleb said, his voice low. "It's like they're watching us." Jason, ever defiant, smirked. "Maybe they're jealous we're alive and they're not." At that moment, a cold draft swept through the corridor, extinguishing the faint light from their flashlights. The air was filled with the faint sound of whispers, murmurs of fear, anger, and despair. As the darkness closed in, Sophia gasped and staggered back, clutching her head. "It's happening again," she cried, her voice filled with panic. "Sophia, what's wrong?" Caleb rushed to her side, but she didn't respond. Her eyes glazed over, and her body trembled as if consumed by an unseen force. In her mind, the corridor transformed. The walls became alive with light and motion. She saw passengers bustling about, their laughter filling the air. But their joy was fleeting. The scene shifted, and the ship was no longer a vessel of luxury, it was a tomb. She saw water flooding the lower decks, dragging screaming passengers into the depths. Others clawed at the walls, their faces twisted in terror. The ship groaned and tilted as the sea claimed it, and amid the chaos, one figure stood still. A woman in a lace veil, her hand raised as though commanding the storm. The vision ended abruptly, and Sophia collapsed into Caleb's arms, gasping for breath. "She's here," she whispered. "The woman. She's part of the curse." "What woman?" Eleanor asked, her voice tight with concern. Before Sophia could respond, the sound of footsteps echoed through the corridor. They turned to see a shadowy figure approaching, a man in a captain's uniform, his face partially obscured by shadow. "Turn back," the man said, his voice low and resonant. "You have no place here." Jason stepped forward, his voice shaking but determined. "Who are you? What happened to this ship?" The captain's figure flickered, as though he were an old film struggling to stay in focus. "I am the keeper of this vessel. I have warned many before you, but none have listened. The Eclipse Mariner is not a ship, it is a prison." Eleanor furrowed her brow. "A prison for what?" "For time," the captain replied. "For souls trapped between the past and the present. We were all cursed by her, the Veiled One, on the night of the storm. She bound us to this ship, doomed to relive our final moments for eternity." Mira tightened her grip on her camera. The Veiled One, the woman in the portrait? The captain's face twisted in anguish. She was not always as you see her now. She was once a passenger, just like the rest, but her grief, her anger, it tore through the fabric of time. She cursed us all to suffer as she has suffered. Sophia, her voice barely a whisper, asked, "How do we stop her?" The captain looked at her with a strange intensity. "To end her curse, you must find the source of her pain. But beware, she will not let you escape so easily. The ship itself will turn against you." As the captain's figure began to fade, the lanterns along the corridor reignited, casting flickering light over the walls. But the portraits were no longer still. The figures within them now moved, their hands pressing against the glass as though trying to break free. "We need to move," Caleb said urgently. The group hurried down the corridor, their footsteps echoing loudly. At the end, they discovered a door that had not been there before. It was engraved with intricate symbols of waves and storms, and beneath them, a single word, chart room. Jason pushed the door open, revealing a large room filled with maps and nautical instruments. A massive table stood in the center, its surface covered with charts of the ship's route. "This must have been where they plotted their course," Eleanor said, running her fingers over the faded maps. Mira examined the charts carefully. "Look at this," she said, pointing to a route marked with bold red ink. The Eclipse Mariner wasn't just a passenger ship. It was carrying something dangerous. "What kind of cargo?" Caleb asked. "Maybe something powerful enough to create this curse," Eleanor speculated. Before they could investigate further, the room began to shake violently. The maps fluttered, and the walls groaned as though the ship itself were protesting their presence. From the shadows, a voice rang out, cold and venomous. "You should not have come." The group spun around, and there she was, the Veiled One, her silhouette illuminated by an unnatural glow. The air grew heavy, suffused with her presence. "Leave now," she said, her voice reverberating with both sorrow and rage, "or share in my torment." The lanterns shattered, plunging the room into darkness as her laughter filled the air. Chapter 4. The Veiled One. The room was pitch black now, the only sound the echoing rhythm of their own breaths as they stood frozen. The Veiled One's presence loomed in the air, thick and suffocating. Caleb's hand instinctively reached for Sophia, who had pulled herself away from the group, her wide, terrified eyes locked onto the specter that hovered before them. The coldness of the air around them seemed to bite at their skin, and despite their fear, they all felt the weight of the Veiled One's gaze on them. "I told you to leave," her voice rasped, a mixture of grief and fury. It seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. Her form flickered like an image on an old film reel, momentarily solid, then disintegrating into a cloud of mist. Jason's voice broke the silence, his words trembling but determined. "Who are you? Why are you doing this?" The Veiled One's laugh was sharp, bitter, and hollow. "Who am I? You would call me the woman who cursed this ship, but I was not always like this." The mist around her seemed to part for a moment, revealing a glimpse of a young woman, a passenger, smiling in a faded photograph. She stood beside a man, who appeared to be her lover, both dressed in grand attire. The figure of the Veiled One seemed to shift again, the woman's face contorted with anguish, her form flickering between time. "I was the captain's daughter. My name was Aurelia." Her voice trembled as the image began to distort once again. "I loved him. I loved him more than I loved anything. But the sea took him from me." Eleanor stepped forward, her voice soft yet commanding. "What happened to him? What did the sea take from you?" Aurelia's figure darkened, becoming sharper and more angular, her eyes glowing with fury. "He died, my father, the captain of this ship. I tried to save him, but I was too late. I cursed the ship, bound it to the sea and to me. I wanted him back, and when the ship sank, I stayed. And I watched as it all sank into the abyss. The curse, it never stops." Her form swirled again, and suddenly the room flashed with scenes from the past. There was a storm, violent, unrelenting, ripping through the ship. The screams of the passengers echoed in the air as waves rose higher than the masts. Aurelia stood at the helm, her hands gripping the wheel with desperation. "I couldn't stop it. I couldn't stop him from dying." Her voice broke, the words choked with grief. The images shifted, showing Aurelia alone, walking the deck at night, eyes filled with grief and madness. "So, I made the pact," she whispered, her voice distorted by the echoing void. "I called on something darker, something ancient. I thought it would bring him back. Instead, I sealed my fate, and the ship's fate too. Now, we are all trapped in this endless cycle." Sophia, shaking, took a step toward Aurelia, her eyes wide with realization. "So, the curse, it's tied to the ship and to you. Your grief, it never stopped." The figure of Aurelia flickered, the sorrow in her eyes deepened. "I thought I could end it. I thought if I brought the ship back to where it all began, I could undo it. But no, it is bound to this vessel, and so am I. The ship cannot leave. It cannot die, and neither can I." As the vision faded, the group found themselves back in the chart room, the walls once again solid and the shadows that had filled the room now retreating. But the air was still heavy with the Veiled One's presence. "We have to break the cycle," Eleanor said, her voice resolute, but her gaze filled with doubt. "We have to find a way to end this. But how?" Jason ran his hands through his hair, pacing back and forth. "We know it's tied to Aurelia. We need to find out what she did to curse the ship. There has to be a way to stop her, to free everyone." Sophia's eyes wandered to the maps once more, noticing something peculiar. One of the charts, tucked beneath a stack of others, was partially hidden. It was marked in the same bold red ink as before, But this time, the route didn't follow the familiar path. The ship's journey didn't seem to lead to any known ports or islands. Instead, it pointed to a vast, uncharted section of the ocean. "That's where it happened," Mira said quietly, pointing to the chart. "It's not just the ship's route. It's where she invoked the curse. We need to go there." The group fell silent. The thought of heading into the heart of the storm, where the curse had begun, filled them all with a palpable dread. But it seemed like the only way out. "We don't have much time," Eleanor said, scanning the chart. "Whatever we need to do, it has to be done there. We can't stay on this ship forever." The journey deeper. The group moved quickly, their feet echoing through the ship's winding corridors as they made their way toward the bridge. Every turn they took seemed to echo with footsteps that weren't their own, the whispers of the cursed souls that had once walked these halls. As they climbed the stairs to the upper deck, a familiar chill swept through the air. The fog had thickened once again, rolling in like a living entity, swallowing the ship whole. "There's no going back now," Jason said grimly. "This place, it doesn't let you leave unless it's ready." A loud crack echoed from somewhere below deck, a sound like the ship itself was groaning in pain. The laughter from the veiled one followed, soft at first, then building into a cacophony of mocking cries. Sophia gripped Caleb's arm, her voice barely audible. I don't know if we can survive this." "We will," Caleb said, his voice firm despite the fear in his eyes. "We have to." The ship's movements became more erratic, as though something in the depths was awakening. The walls trembled, and the floor beneath them seemed to buckle with each passing moment. "The heart of the curse is below deck," Eleanor said, her face pale. "Let's finish this." With one last look at the darkening horizon, they descended into the belly of the ship, where the storm was born, where Aurelia had made her final choice. Chapter 5. The Heart of the Curse. The descent into the lower decks felt like an eternity. The closer they got to the belly of the ship, the heavier the air became. The ship groaned as if in agony, its timbers creaking with every step they took. The corridor grew narrower, more claustrophobic, and the stench of salt water and decay filled their nostrils. The whispers of the dead grew louder, more insistent, urging them to turn back. "Keep moving," Eleanor said, her voice a thin thread in the suffocating silence. "We're almost there." Sophia, who had been unusually quiet, kept her eyes on the floor, her feet heavy with each step. The ship's eerie atmosphere weighed on her, and every shadow seemed to stretch toward them. She could feel the eyes of the cursed souls watching them, their presence almost tangible. "We should have never come here," Caleb muttered, but his words were lost to the oppressive silence that swallowed the ship. Suddenly, they reached a large door at the end of the passageway. It was old, rusted, and adorned with symbols they hadn't seen before. Ancient symbols, as though they had been carved by a hand not of this world. The door was ajar, but the air beyond it felt thick, charged with an unnatural energy. Jason pushed the door open, and a cold gust of air hit them in the face. The room beyond was vast, almost cavernous. The walls were lined with strange markings, and at the center stood a large, cracked mirror, its surface shimmering with an eerie light. "That's it," Mira said, her voice a whisper. "That's the source." In front of the mirror stood a pedestal, on which lay an ornate box, the edges gleaming with gold. The box was delicate yet ancient, covered in runes and symbols that matched those on the door. But what caught their attention the most was the reflection in the mirror. It wasn't their own faces that stared back at them. Instead, the image was of a woman, Aurelia. She stood in the same position as she had in their vision, but her face was full of rage and sorrow, her eyes wild with madness. "The mirror!" Sophia gasped, taking a hesitant step forward. "It's not just a reflection. It's a doorway, a window into her past." "She's been waiting for us," Eleanor said, her voice trembling. "She's trapped us in her curse." The veiled one's voice echoed from the depths of the mirror, her words like a thunderclap. "You think you can break it? You think you can undo what I've done? The ship is mine, and so are you." The air around them grew colder still, and the ship seemed to groan louder, as if the very structure of the vessel was about to collapse under the weight of the curse. The final choice. The group stood frozen as Aurelia's image in the mirror began to move, her hands reaching out toward them, her lips twisted into a grin that was not of this world. Her voice resonated in their minds, each word sinking into their souls. "You cannot escape," she whispered. "None of you can. The ship is your prison, and your fate is tied to mine. Forever." Sophia stepped forward, her eyes locked on the mirror. "You don't have to do this. You don't have to keep us here. You can let us go." Aurelia's expression faltered, the anger fading for a moment, replaced by a deep sadness. "You don't understand. I didn't choose this. I only wanted to save him. I didn't know what I was calling forth." The shadows in the room seemed to grow deeper, darker. The whispers of the dead filled the space again, louder now, each voice overlapping with the others, urging Aurelia to reclaim her power, to drag them all into the abyss. "This is your choice," Aurelia said, her voice cracking. "You can join me. You can stay here, with me and the others who have been cursed, or you can break the mirror. But know this, if you shatter the mirror, the curse will take one of you in its place." Jason's breath hitched. "What do you mean, take one of us?" "The ship will claim the soul of one of you," Aurelia said, her image in the mirror growing more distorted. "That is the price of breaking the curse. One life for another." The group turned to each other, the weight of the decision sinking in. They could feel the tension in the air. Their breaths shallow, their hearts racing. The ship groaned again, and the floor beneath their feet trembled. "We can't leave one of us behind," Caleb said, his voice tight with fear and determination. "We can't let the curse keep taking lives." "But how do we break it?" Mira asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "We can't just destroy the mirror. We don't know what will happen." Eleanor's eyes narrowed. "It's not just about breaking the mirror. It's about ending Aurelia's grief. We need to take away the thing she's clinging to. We need to give her what she lost. The sacrifice." Without warning, the air turned to ice, and the walls began to close in. The ship's groan grew louder, almost deafening. The whispering voices of the souls reached a crescendo, and the light from the mirror flickered, casting strange shadows on the walls. Sophia looked at Aurelia's face in the mirror one last time, the sadness in her eyes mirroring her own sorrow. She realized what they had to do. "I know what you need," she said quietly. "You don't need to keep us here. You need peace. We can give you peace." Sophia stepped closer to the pedestal, her hands trembling as she reached for the ornate box. She could feel the power radiating from it, the energy of the curse pulsing in her fingertips. She opened the box. Inside was a small, delicate locket, a locket she had seen before. It was the same locket that hung around the neck of the woman in the portrait, the one that had haunted her dreams. "This is it," Sophia whispered, holding the locket up to the mirror. "Aurelia, this is what you've been searching for. This is the memory of what you lost." The veiled one's image in the mirror flickered once more, her eyes softening as she reached for the locket. For the first time in what seemed like eternity, there was a moment of silence. And then, without warning, the mirror shattered. The end of the curse. The ship let out one final groan before everything went still. The oppressive weight of the curse lifted, the coldness receding, the whispers fading into nothingness. The air grew warm again, and the ship, no longer a prison, seemed to release its hold on the souls that had been trapped aboard for so long. Sophia, exhausted and shaken, looked around at the group. They were all standing in the center of the now quiet room, their eyes wide with disbelief. The ship was no longer the same. It no longer felt alive, as though the ship itself had exhaled a final breath and was at peace. "We did it," Caleb said, his voice a mixture of relief and exhaustion. Eleanor nodded, still in shock. But at what cost? They looked at the shattered mirror, the remnants of the curse now scattered in shards across the floor. "We broke the cycle," Sophia said quietly, "but we'll never forget what happened here. None of us will." With the ship now still, the group left the cursed place behind, walking toward the deck. The fog had lifted, and the sun, which had been obscured for so long, now shone brightly on the horizon. The Eclipse Mariner, no longer a prison, was free, and so were they. And so, the cursed ship continues its eternal voyage, a ghostly specter drifting between time and memory. Those who dare to uncover its secrets risk losing themselves to the same relentless loop, forever trapped in its haunted embrace. Perhaps some mysteries of the sea are better left hidden in the depths. Thank you for joining me on this stormy night, here on the Rainy Night Storyteller. If these tales of rain, mystery, and the supernatural have captured your imagination, please let me know by leaving a like. Don't forget to subscribe and click the notification bell so you won't miss our next chilling story. Until we meet again, may the rain soothe your dreams, and may the night keep its secrets for now.